Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Good evening to those of you outside of California. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I warmly welcome you to tonight's America at a Crossroads virtual town hall program. We are very grateful to have as our guest tonight the scholar of the Constitution and Democratic Institutions, Noah Feldman, and political sociologist Larry Diamond. It is an auspicious time to be hearing from both of our speakers for obvious reasons, but also because next week Noah Feldman's 10th book will be released, The Broken Constitution, Lincoln, Slavery, and the Refounding of America. After tonight's program in the email, you'll get a link so that you can look at the book and possibly purchase it if you're interested. We hope that you will and are. While the topics we have been covering are heavy and sometimes even disturbing, we try to bring the best possible minds to bear on the most critical topics pertaining to the preservation of our American democracy. And let's face it, it can be disturbing. But the mission of this America at a Crossroads series is to provide programs which inspire us to stay informed, engaged, and strong, as well as motivated as we strive to shore up the foundations of our fragile democracy and its institutions. Full unedited recordings of all of our programs can be found on our YouTube channel and on our website. An easy to use link is provided in every email that David or I send to you. Our judge leadership team includes former Congressman Mel Levine, David Lehrer, former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazen. You saw our list of co-sponsors on the screen a moment ago, and we are grateful to our co-sponsors, and special thanks to Joel Mogi for his assistance in helping with our programming. Next week, we will host the always interesting and thoughtful George Will, and the week after, we will welcome Congressman Adam Schiff. So we hope that you'll join us. Please register early, and if you aren't getting the Zoom links, it's probably because either they're in your spam or you advertently or inadvertently unsubscribe from our list. You can go to our website to re-register or send me an email and I will do it for you. Now, my terrific colleague, David Lehrer, will share a bit more about others of our upcoming programs. David?
Thank you, Janice. I'm pleased to also be welcoming you to America at a Crossroads this evening. Tonight's program is a companion to last week's discussion with Professor Rick Haston and Slate's Dahlia Lithwick. They discussed the threats to our legal system that emanate from the cases that are on the Supreme Court docket for this term, from voting rights to civil rights to abortion. It was an enlightening and troubling hour. This week may leave us in a similar disequilibrium, more educated but more concerned. Tonight, we're exploring the trajectory of American democracy with two of the very best and brightest people one could want to grapple with this issue, Harvard's Noah Feldman and Stanford's Larry Diamond. I'll introduce Larry in a moment, but I wanted to mention two upcoming programs. In 3 weeks, on November 10th, we'll have the incisive Steve Schmidt, former Republican strategist and campaign manager, discussing the state of the nation with Democratic guru and head of USC's Center for the Political Future, Bob Shrum, a frequent moderator on our programs. The following week, on November 17th, we'll be hosting Congressman James Clyburn, the Democratic whip of the House of Representatives and the man who played a crucial, if not historic, role in the Democratic primaries last year. To introduce this evening's guest and moderate our discussion, a return host on this broadcast, Professor Larry Diamond of the Hoover Institution and Stanford University. He's the author and editor of countless books and articles on democracy studies. He's been an advisor to governments and international organizations for decades, helping them to develop democratic institutions, work that we need to do here as well. Larry?
Thank you very much, David. I want to thank everyone for joining. I must say, I thought you were going to introduce Noah, but we have with us one of the most remarkable constitutional thinkers in the United States of America, Professor of Constitutional Law, Noah Feldman, who has been a clerk for a Supreme Court justice, an advisor on the constitutional development process in Iraq, and we don't blame him for the fact that it didn't go as well as it should have. A prolific author whose forthcoming book I have already heard him talk about, and I think is a seminal historical work that speaks to our time, The Broken Constitution, Lincoln's Slavery and the Refounding of America. He leads the most prestigious academic fellows program in the United States, the Harvard Academy. He is one of the most popular law professors at, probably the top law school in the United States, if not the world, Harvard Law. And he is just, I think, one of the most seminal public intellectuals of our time. And Noah, that's all just from the top of my head. So welcome to you and thank you for joining us.
Larry, it's a huge honor to be here. And that was a much too generous introduction. I guess it's good to be introduced by someone who's unprepared. It makes you more generous. Thanks to David and Janice. I just want to say what an honor it is to appear with Larry, whose work has really, to an extraordinary degree, defined how people think about democracy as a phenomenon and democratic institutions really over the last 35 years. It's been an honor for me to get to know Larry and to work indirectly with him on some projects, including the Iraq project. It's not Larry's responsibility any more than it is mine how that turned out. Please don't hold that against us. And it's really just an honor to have a chance to speak with you.
Great, Noah. So let's get started with the big question that this remarkable town hall program has been pondering and really agonizing over since it began a year and a half ago. Quite simply, how much trouble do you think American democracy is in now?
We were joking before the program came on that it's important to have a little bit of optimism. And so I thought, with apologies for the fact that this is a program with a Jewish affiliation, that I could answer the question by saying it could be worse. And I think it could be worse, but it also could be a lot better. We're not in a great place for democracy itself. The good news is that as a consequence of Donald Trump losing the election and the institutions of electoral regulation in the United States, primarily, I mean, the local officials throughout the country who counted the votes, being remarkably not only honest and professional, but remarkably resistant to tremendous political pressure for them to say that there was distortion when there in fact wasn't. We actually survived the biggest threat that our democracy has faced in a long time, namely 4 years of Donald Trump, followed by the claims of a fraudulent election, followed by an attack on the Capitol. And the fact that we survived those things is not something we should treat as minor. I wouldn't say it takes us fully to anti-fragility, but it does take us to the point of acknowledging that the crucial institutions that had to hold up did hold up. And that includes the Supreme Court, which had a majority appointed by Donald Trump, ultimately, with 3 appointees from Donald Trump, and did not take up the direct invitation from the Trump administration to overthrow the democratic election results. The bad part is that our polarization, which I don't think is completely unprecedented, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit, but which is on the high side of being as bad as it's been, and certainly as bad as it's been in the post-World War II era, is deep enough and threatens the possibility of dysfunction enough to make us genuinely concerned for the health of democracy as a set of institutions. Because as Larry, as you've taught for many, many years, democracy requires consciousness on both sides that there will be alteration of power, and that as a consequence of that alteration of power, we're going to respect one another, not necessarily because we like each other, but because we know we're going to be on the losing side. And as people get more and more polarized, they turn more and more to winner-take-all politics. And that, again, as you've taught for many years, is a bad sign for the capacity of democracy to balance itself. And so that's, I would say, at the micro level, we survived a serious threat, but on the other side, the deep dangers remain.
So let me probe the current state of danger and then ask you why. And then I don't want to get very far into this before we get to your new book. But you talk in a way about breaking the Constitution, breaking the rules or norms as they were understood. But that was done to save democracy. We now have a set of political actors, as we've been exploring and trying to understand how to respond to over and over in this series, who are trying to break the norms, not for the purpose of saving democracy, but for permanently tilting it in an undemocratic direction. Some of those actors behind Trump, around Trump, I'd say in the undemocratic wing of the Republican Party, which seems alarmingly to be becoming the dominant wing of the Republican Party, seem to show signs of having figured out why they failed institutionally and judicially in 2020 to reverse the outcome of a free and fair election, and seem to be implanting or pursuing legal strategies for trying to prevail in 2024 if they have to, in a way that they failed in 2020. So are you worried that there are still legal, judicial, and political vulnerabilities that could enable them to succeed next time where they failed last time?
There are. And probably just to name one that worries me the most is the Electoral Counting Act, which unfortunately goes all the way back to the 19th century and is about as rickety as you would expect for something that old, which effectively, it's not written this way, but it effectively leaves it to the discretion of the congressional majority to determine whether the states have submitted valid electoral results. And again, it's not written as broadly as all that, but in practice, that's the breadth that's in it. And that badly needs reform, but it's not so simple to get that reform. And right now, to get that reform, you'd have to really force it through Congress. Incidentally, if I were the Democrats, that is one of the things where I would break the filibuster and go for it because I think it matters. The counterargument, though, would be that no matter what laws Congress passed, if there were a congressional majority that was Republican, they might try to ignore that law, no matter how it was written, or they might try to force through an emendation of that law, and those are genuine risks. So I guess there are institutional dangers there, no doubt about it. That said, I also don't want concern, which is real, to fade into a tone of panic. You know, the Republicans that you're talking about, the sort of Steve Bannonite wing of the Republican Party, do have an impulse, and Bannon has been saying this openly for a long time, to break the system overall, including breaking democracy. And in Donald Trump, they had someone who was willing to go all the way there, or almost all the way there, in order to try to retain power. But what they never quite brushed up against was the pushback from the pro-business side of the Republican Party that would have become extremely worried about the threat to the markets via the threat to economic stability that would come from genuine breaking of the democratic process. And even Donald Trump seemed very worried about taking action that would fundamentally disrupt the stability of the markets. So then you have to ask yourself, what are the markets thinking? And I think the short answer, and of course, you know, it's always possible to grossly oversimplify because you're talking about an aggregation of many different people's judgment when you talk about the markets. But the markets seem to believe that that wing of the Republican Party will push the democratic process as close to the edge as they can get away with without breaking fundamental trust in the rule of law and thereby crashing the markets. And if that's right, and it's a big if to, you know, bet the future of democracy on, then even another Donald Trump term, which would be horrific in almost every way you can imagine, might not go so far as to seek the kind of subversion of the democratic process and of our constitutional norms that would be seen by the markets as creating fundamental instability. And I think a lot of people, even in the Republican Party, think that January 6th just went further than Donald Trump expected that it would. And they also think that after all, the police did put down the riot, Congress did reconvene, did vote to recognize Joe Biden, and that that is the important takeaway, rather than the, to my mind, also very important takeaway, namely that a lot of Republican congressmen were prepared to cast irrational and implausible votes, claiming the election was rigged, even after the attack on the Capitol, which is, to be fair, terribly shocking. But they did so with the knowledge that the election was going to be ratified. And in that sense, you might be able to argue a bit optimistically, I mean, optimistically is the wrong word, but a bit less pessimistically, that they were doing that to please their base with no danger that would actually lead to fundamental disruption.
Mm-hmm. Well, in a way, you've created an awkward situation because I'm going to reveal a secret in case people don't already know it. Janice and David always want us to try to end on an optimistic note, and you've just shared with us what I think is the most powerful current of optimism or reassurance, if there is one, that the health of the American economy is intricately tied to the health of American democracy. And markets understand that, and American corporations understand that. And I think in 2020, the history of what happened and how Republican legislatures were discouraged preemptively from trying to steal the election still hasn't fully been written, and maybe it shouldn't be for a long time, but business played an important role. So please try and think of something positive to say in addition before we close. No, let's put this in historical perspective. We're a couple weeks away. I think the launch date is November 2nd from what's going to be a remarkable book, your latest book, and they're pretty remarkable, each one, The Broken Constitution, Lincoln's Slavery and the Refounding of America. I had the privilege of hearing you talk about this at the Sun Valley Writers Conference. So I know how important this is, not only to our understanding of history, but to the current moment. You argue that in some respects, Lincoln had to break the Constitution in order to remake it and thus save the Republic. Are there any lessons from that experience that can inform our current plight?
Thanks, Larry, for that question. Yeah, there are two major lessons here. The first has to do with a problem that we're still facing today, that was a problem facing America in the run-up to the Civil War. And that is, was our original Constitution, the Constitution of 1787, so deeply intertwined with the principle of slavery and the idea of white supremacy that undergirded slavery, because you couldn't have African slavery without a proposition that one race was superior to the other, that fundamentally tainted the nature of the country. And then the second takeaway has to do with how you get out of circumstances of that kind of deep polarization, of the kind that led to the Civil War. So let me say a quick word about the first problem and how Lincoln had to break the Constitution, and then have that lead to the second takeaway. So on the first point, the painful truth, and I really didn't fully take this on board before doing the research for this book, even though I'd written a book about James Madison, and that inevitably involved a lot of inquiry into the founding of the country, into the drafting of the Constitution, I hadn't really taken on board to what extent the Constitution really depended on a compromise between North and South over slavery. That was emerging at the Constitutional Convention, and it was only over the course of a long, hot summer, when they were done compromising about the Senate and whether it would have equal representation for the big and small states, that some of the smartest delegates started writing in their diaries, boy, it looks like the real issue here is not actually big state, small state. The real issue is free state, slave state. Because as the United States expanded westward, driven in large part by the opportunities for cotton growth during the 19th century, it destabilized that compromise. As you all know, the big debate was every time we had a new state, which we needed to expand, would that state be slave or free? So there was a paradox. The Constitution was useful to let the country expand, but every time it expanded, it destabilized the compromise. And so the way our ancestors dealt with this is by making new compromises again and again. You know, the Missouri Compromise, the compromise over the tariff, the Compromise of 1850, these were all attempts to shore up the guarantee of slavery. And that remained until the Civil War. And that was the feature of the Constitution that was fundamentally broken by secession, and that Lincoln himself had to break by declaring emancipation. And just to be clear, in retrospect, we think, of course he did that, that was so great. But Lincoln himself believed his whole political career, and up until the Civil War itself, that for him to free the slaves on his own without Congress was an act of dictatorship. And that was his word, used multiple times throughout his life, including at the beginning of the Civil War. So he broke the Constitution because he thought that the South had already broken it, and because he thought that he needed to assure that we would not go back to a compromise over slavery again. You could say it was the breaking of the Constitution under conditions of existential crisis. So to me, the takeaway from that is, when our compromise is based on something fundamentally immoral, we can't recreate it. But the Constitution that emerged from that act of emancipation and from the passage of the anti-slavery amendment, the 13th Amendment, and the Equal Protection Amendment, the 14th, and the enfranchisement of Black people, the 15th, was not an immoral constitution. It was a moral constitution, imperfectly and sometimes very imperfectly applied. And so today, I think we don't need a breaking of the Constitution. What we need is a better and more thorough enforcement of the promises of liberty and equality that are carried in our Constitution. So that's my first big takeaway. You do need to break the Constitution when there's no going back to the immorality, but we don't have the Constitution of 1787 anymore. What we really have is the Constitution of Lincoln and of the Reconstruction Amendments. The second big takeaway has to do with how do you avoid the kind of polarization that actually led to a civil war? And that's a live question for us today because we have a profound polarization in our country with deeply different beliefs about the direction the country should go. And my own answer to that is that we need to look to the things that actually practically unite us as a country, the values that we share, and the concrete interests that we share. And I would love to hear politicians on both sides saying more about not what unites us symbolically, because we know that right now what divides us symbolically is almost more important than what unites us, but what practically unites us, the reasons that we don't actually want to live in two different countries, even where our values are fundamentally different. And I think that, especially in a world where China is rising and the threat to democracy globally is increasing, and where the American position of unquestioned global leadership that we've enjoyed since the end of the Cold War is very much in question, I think at that point, we can see more clearly the benefits to all of us of being united as a country and the costs of not being united. And I hope that that can be a second takeaway from that experience. We do not want the Civil War in which we deeply weakened ourselves in our global position, and in which we did not ultimately create true unity. We solved the problem of slavery, but we nevertheless still had deep divisions. So we need something better than that. We need something that is a democracy based on the recognition of common interests.
Right. Okay. I normally wait for another 20 minutes or so before getting to the audience questions, but there's one that just naturally follows from what you've been saying. So we don't have an immoral constitution anymore as it's evolving, but we do have undemocratic political practice within it that needs to be confronted. And certainly many people think one of the moral imperatives in this regard is to defend voting rights and democratic, neutral, fair administration of elections, for which, as you said, reforming the Electoral Count Act of 1886 is important. The Freedom to Vote Act, which was did not succeed in the Senate today, as we presumed it would not succeed, didn't include reform of the Electoral Count Act, but it did do an awful lot of other things that people thought were necessary to defend voting rights and fulfill that promise you were talking about. So what do you think the impact of this defeat will be, and how do we move forward with the defense and reform of democracy, given this defeat, if it's not kind of surmounted by the repeal of the filibuster, at least for this one measure?
So here, what I'm going to say is, I want to be careful in characterizing it. Maybe I should just say it and characterize it afterwards. But what I'm going to say is a little less doomsaying than the instinct that says that the failure of this act shows the fundamental, decay of democracy in America. So I want to say that constitutional democracy is not always truly majoritarian. The basic idea here, going all the way back to our founding, is that in a constitutional democracy, you have to satisfy minorities, and that means giving them disproportionate power in order to keep them having a stake in the system. And the biggest example of this is one I actually already mentioned, and that is the idea that small states and large states have the same amount of representation in the Senate. Now, that is grossly undemocratic. And at the 1787 convention, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, lots of people from big states said again and again and again, this shall not stand. This is absurd. You're giving the people of Rhode Island and Delaware the same amount of power as the people of Virginia. Today, we would say as the people of California. And even though the percentage of disproportion wasn't quite as big then as it is now, it was still enormous. It was still like 30 or 40 times the population size. But they were stuck with it, and the small states called a walkout, and the big states accepted it, though they didn't want it. And since then, we've had a range of features in our Constitution that are counter-majoritarian. And I would also include the filibuster in that, which is not consistent at all with majoritarian government. Now, would I like to see all of those changed up to and including the Senate? Yeah. Can we survive as a democracy even without doing so? Yes. The same is true of partisan gerrymandering. Partisan gerrymandering is awful, and I wish that Justice Kennedy, before he resigned from the court, had been convinced to provide the fifth vote to rule it unconstitutional and inconsistent with the principle of one person, one vote. He didn't. And this law that didn't go through was trying to solve that problem through congressional legislation. And the reason it didn't is that ultimately enough Americans are willing to live with the system of partisan gerrymandering, which happens to disadvantage the majority in many cases. It often gives an opportunity to something that's less than a majority, in this case, often Republicans, to have disproportionate power. I don't want that. I want everyone to be represented equally and have true one person, one vote. But we can survive that phenomenon, provided that it isn't unequal on the basis, say, of race. Now, the Voting Rights Act had a series of mechanisms in place to try to avoid that from happening. The court undercut those by striking down an important part of the Voting Rights Act, the pre-clearance section. I think that was a terrible decision by the Supreme Court. But again, I would say it's within the power of Congress, if they really wanted to, and we had the votes, to restore that part of the Voting Rights Act. And Congress hasn't done it. Again, because enough Americans are okay with the idea that at the margins, there will be some mechanisms put in place by state legislatures that advantage Republicans over Democrats. I would count that as part of the concession that the majority makes to the minority. In this case, the Democrats make to Republicans, because in numerical terms, Democrats are a majority in the United States, consistent with keeping that side of the political spectrum still involved in politics. So again, this is a post hoc rationalization. It's not what I would like to have seen. I would love to have seen this law pass. But I think we can survive it because I think the distortions of democracy that are entailed, and they are distortions, are not existential threats at this stage to our constitutional democracy. They lead to individual cases of immorality, they lead to bad things, but they're not collectively so bad that they threaten the very idea of democratic elections.
Okay,
And you should, by the way, I know you don't agree with a lot of that, Larry, so I think the audience would love to hear you disagree with that.
I disagree with it slightly in this sense. I think that there has emerged in the Republican Party a wing that is now dominant because of fealty to Donald Trump, may not remain so indefinitely, that is willing to compromise free and fair elections to achieve what they would regard as lasting, obviously nothing is permanent, minority rule. And actually, I think that is an existential threat to democracy. And I think the point that Rick Hasen has been making, beginning with his, I think, op-ed in the New York Times in April of this year, of the distinction between voter suppression laws, which are odious, but, you know, as you said, we can probably survive them by mobilizing around them, and voter subversion, electoral subversion laws, which would enable Republicans to take control of the electoral counting and certification process, that is to me an existential threat to the future of democracy that I think we're in danger of not being able to counter the next time around because of radical Republican strategies to put in place changes in law at the state level, which would enable capture of the process, essentially. That would be my response.
Look, I think you're right to be worried about that, and we shall see. You know, it's one thing for Republicans to gain some control over the machinery of vote counting. It's another thing for Republicans to go full Trump and just lie overtly about the results of the election. And I was somewhat heartened by the fact that many of the people, secretaries of state in Georgia, for example, and elsewhere in the last election, were what I would call technically honest people. They were public servants. They said, I'm loyal to the people who counted these ballots. They work for me. They didn't lie. The numbers don't lie. There's been no cheating in this election. And that massively undercut Trump's big lie to the point where even the people who supported Donald Trump, I think, knew that it was a lie. Now, that's also scary because they knew that it was a lie and they still were willing to go forward with it. But the fact that the truth was out there is not nothing. And, you know, if we reached the point where large amounts of public servants were willing to just lie in this way, I agree, then democracy is under existential threat. Then we're where, you know, James Madison would say, there has to be some basic political virtue in the people to run a republic. And if the elected officials are willing to lie fundamentally about the results of the voting, then that's the definition of not satisfying political virtue. So am I scared about that? Yes, but I don't think we're there yet. And I have, you know, perhaps it's naive, but I have some trust in ordinary Americans, regardless of party, to tell the truth about things like that. And I think that trust was to some degree vindicated in the last election. I mean, for what it's worth, I was predicting before the last election that we could rely on the honesty, trustworthiness, and straightforwardness of those state electoral officials. And lots of my, you know, colleagues and friends whom I respect said, no, you can't. You know, these are hacks, they're Republicans, but those Republican quote unquote hacks did really well, extremely well in the last election. And that gives me some more than modest hope in who we are as a country. And I hope that doesn't make me too naive. From your facial expression, I think you think it does.
Well, it's just that my response is because of that, my prediction is that Brad Raffensperger is not going to be the Secretary of State of Georgia after the next midterm elections. He's going to be defeated in a Republican primary by a Republican who will not do the right thing. And then there's either going to be a Democratic Secretary of State or that radical Republican. But let's walk up to the buffet of institutional reform options, some of them statutory, some of them perhaps constitutional, and see how you'd feel about them. Start with a little bit of what we've been talking about in terms of the guarantee of minority rights, the Senate filibuster. I guess the three options are keep it where it is now, and it's already been rolled back because it no longer applies to judges. Pare it back further in terms of what it applies to. Pare it back in terms of a talking filibuster, or get rid of the darn thing altogether. Where do you come out on that debate?
If it were up to me, I would get rid of the filibuster. The fact that we haven't gotten rid of it tells you something. It tells you that even at a moment with a Democratic majority in the Senate, it's a bare majority, 50-50 plus the vice president. But even with that majority, you can't get rid of the filibuster because the people at the center of the Senate still believe that it's valuable to have it under some circumstances. Look, the reason I would get rid of it altogether is that it's being chipped away at. And eventually, if this process continues, it's going to be gone anyway. So might as well take the bull by the horns and just do it and have it out of the way. It's counter-majoritarian. It has a nasty history associated with Southern Democrats using it to block civil rights bills. It will not be mourned once it's gone. I am sad about the fact that we've reached that point. You know, there was a time when the function of the filibuster was to enable a relatively moderate middle in the Senate to slow down change in the country. And there were times when that caution was valuable, other times when it was awful, for example, when it was used to block civil rights bills. But we don't have that kind of a moderate center that's capable of acting rationally now. So I think we'd be better off without it. Realistically, I don't think we're close to its elimination. I think it's likely to remain in place until such time as you have a Republican Senate, Republican House, and a Republican president, and they realize there's something really important that they can push through. And even then it might not happen, because it's usually Democrats who want transformative legislation, not Republicans. Republicans usually prefer that there not be legislation than that there be transformative legislation. And so then it might have to remain in place until the Democrats have a larger number of votes and a little more confidence in their capacity. And now we're very much in your realm more than mine. It doesn't look like that's about to happen anytime soon.
I agree. And there are a lot of moderate Democratic senators who won't say so, but in the current climate, but really don't want to get rid of the filibuster for a lot of the reasons you're articulating. Senator Manchin, who actually will be appearing in this series in the not too distant future, has said, and I'm sure he's going to be asked here when he joins us, that he'd be open to returning the filibuster to the practice that prevailed, where you know, filibustering senators had to hold the floor in order to prevail.
I think that's kind of appealing in a sort of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington kind of way. You know, it would create visible television moments. It would make it a little more costly for senators to engage in a filibuster because people would see them doing it. That's definitely better than what we have now, but it's not a genuine solution. And it could actually run in the other direction. If you have senators who think that by doing that, they can gain national attention, you know, senators being senators, they will sometimes just do that in order to make themselves big names. So you could imagine there's, even though we have an instinct, it'd be great to go back to that. We might actually regret doing that too.
Oh, interesting point. I haven't heard that made yet. Okay, now you've spoken a great deal about polarization. There's been an argument that's floating out there, getting a little bit of momentum, that this is partly due to the incentive structure that's being generated by our electoral system. You know, you're not only a constitutional law professor, you're a very good political scientist, and you've thought about these issues. So some people have suggested maybe ranked choice voting would be a way of changing the incentive structure. Some people have recommended going further to proportional representation. Some states, as you know, are beginning to implement changes on your own. What's your take on this?
Well, I sort of have 2 points on it. The first is it's kind of noteworthy that we're getting these prescriptions that blame our polarization on our first past the post system, given that, you know, as recently as when I was taking my political science courses in college, the standard teaching was that proportional representation systems tended to drive you towards extremist parties, with Israel being a classic case study example that some viewers will be familiar with. Where if you don't have to have that many people who support a position for that party to get elected. And in principle, our system was supposed to drive people back towards the center, because if you're only going to elect one person per district and Democrats and Republicans are roughly equally divided, you need to be moderate in order to win. Now, what's been breaking that is partisan gerrymandering. And partisan gerrymandering is way more sophisticated. It's been with us since the founding, but since even before the founding, but what's made it more sophisticated are the computer programs that allow it to be done with greater skill. And given that distortion, the simplest solution is one we mentioned earlier, and that is to reduce or eliminate partisan gerrymandering. If you could make that change, you wouldn't need to make the move towards proportionate representation. So then the practical question to ask is one of those easier to get enacted at a state-by-state level than the other? And just judging empirically, more states have adopted the principle of nonpartisan districting through an independent commission than have been willing to experiment with proportional representation. So practically, I think we should favor whichever one is more likely to move us back towards a system that drives people back towards the center. And my instinct, again, without being able to prove it definitively, but my instinct is that because more states seem open to that kind of districting model, that's what we should be advocating for. We should be, putting our money and our effort behind state-by-state efforts to lobby for state referendums, because the legislatures are not going to get you there, but for state referendums that would implement nonpartisan districting using using an independent commission system. Again, the way a non-trivial number of states have. You'll know the exact number. I don't recall it, but it's a good number. So I think we should. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's the shortest distance between 2 points, and I would prefer to see that. Failing that, ranked choice voting or proportional representation are certainly experiments worth experimenting with. And whether they'll be adopted depends on how risk-taking the American public is willing to be around those questions. Those are genuine experiments. And as things seem like they're breaking, we're more likely to have those kinds of experiments being introduced.
Before we get to a few more of the excellent questions that are coming in, I want to ask you about whether we should think about reforming the Supreme Court. You have, as I will repeat, clerked for the Supreme Court. You've been inside the institution. Democrats have held the presidency for almost as long as Republicans in the last century, but Republicans have named, I think, 11 of the 15 Supreme Court justices who've been named in that period. It's kind of unfair. It's the way cookie crumbles, right? It's just the luck of the draw, but it's been a pretty unlucky draw for Democrats. Some people are arguing now, Ro Khanna has sponsored a bill to impose term limits on the Supreme Court, at least on new appointments. So eventually the Supreme Court might enlarge, and then it would shrink down as there were retirements to justices who were appointed for 18 years, at least to serve on the Supreme Court. They could then serve out longer on the federal bench, and a president would get to name one justice every other year. What do you think of that, or any other reform of Supreme Court appointments?
So it's been a big testifying year for me. I mean, what I was doing every day was working on my Lincoln book, but first I testified in favor of Donald Trump's impeachment, and then I testified in front of the Supreme Court Reform Commission that Joe Biden appointed. So I'll tell you what I told that commission. What I said is, first of all, I don't think that barring a very extreme act by the Supreme Court, and maybe overturning Roe v. Wade would be that, but barring that, I don't think it's a good idea to pack the Supreme Court by adding a bunch of new justices, because the Democrats do it now, the Republicans will do it next, and soon the Supreme Court will not be able to expand rights the way it's expanded gay rights and trans rights in recent years. And I think progressives should care about the Supreme Court's ability to do that. We should be afraid of the bad things the Supreme Court do, but we should remember the good things that it's capable of doing. When it comes to term limits, my own view is it would take a constitutional amendment to do it. I don't think you can do it by legislation constitutionally, by which I mean that I think the current justices would strike it down unless there were a constitutional amendment. But I actually do favor term limits to be adopted by constitutional amendment, not so much because of the balance, but because I hate the way that Supreme Court watchers, and I'm one, spend our time worrying about the health of the justices. And then a misjudgment by one of the justices about his or her own health can have disastrous consequences. I admired, and in many ways revered Justice Ginsburg, as I'm sure many of the people on the call did, but that doesn't mean that we can pretend that it's not the case that, towards the end of her life, when she had been diagnosed with 2 very serious cancers, which she lasted much longer than anyone with those cancers normally lasts, and after her husband passed away, and at the time when she was being suddenly lionized as the notorious RBG, she disastrously stayed on the Supreme Court when she shouldn't have done, not just because she gambled that Hillary Clinton would win, but because she knew her health was not great and she should have stepped down. And that has had disastrous consequences, including imperiling Roe v. Wade, which is not what Justice Ginsburg would have wanted. These kinds of considerations should not be part of how we think about the Supreme Court. We should not have to write op-eds or have private conversations with the justices that say, it's really time for you to move on and retire. Those don't work, for one thing. People write those op-eds and the justices ignore them. Private conversations sometimes work and sometimes don't. We shouldn't be in that business. And, my job as an analyst of the Supreme Court should not require me to also be, an expert in the survivability rates of different forms of cancer. That shouldn't be in my job description, but it is. So I would love to see those kind of term limits, but we need an amendment to get there. And I don't think that kind of amendment is likely to be forthcoming right now.
Let me just ask you to ponder this briefly, and then I'd like to ask about another institutional issue that someone has raised, predictably. The further we go out in terms of when any reform would become effective, the more we're all hiding behind the Rawlsian veil of uncertainty. We don't know who would gain political advantage from it. So what if the reform to start imposing term limits on future appointments, didn't become effective for 15 years? Neither Republicans nor Democrats would know who's going to be advantaged by that. Would that change the calculus at all, you think?
It might. I think to get the impetus to pass a constitutional amendment, both sides have to be gambling that it's in their interests. And right now, Republicans are noticing that, as you said, they got really lucky in the last round of the game of poker. So they don't want to replace poker with some other game. Yeah. So that's the problem. We haven't talked about this yet, but one of the important background issues for everything we're talking about is the background predictions that people have about what voting patterns are going to look like in the future. And broadly speaking, both Republicans and Democrats in the United States think that more and more people are going to vote Democratic and fewer people are going to vote Republican. And they're acting according to those expectations. Republicans trying to do everything they can to maintain electoral parity without the votes, and Democrats trying to get everyone to the polls in the hopes of dealing with the fact that Republicans are going to be pushing back this way. And, that's the complex game that's being played. The best thing Democrats can do is, to follow the Georgia strategy, to follow the strategy of getting every person to the polls that is possible. And the more the Democrats do that, the more a lot of these debates will look like they're marginal debates rather than debates at the center.
Well, or you could say the more the Democrats do that, the more the Republicans will try and pass laws to keep that mobilization from being effective.
They will, but that doesn't mean it'll be sufficient.
Okay, let me ask about the Electoral College. You probably never escape a question about the institutional future of democracy, a session without a question about that. And let me ask, not only because you can probably answer it in a sentence, what you would wish for with respect to the Electoral College, but a question I've been really agonizing over. We have a bill that's been passed in a number of states that would purport to neutralize the Electoral College if enough states accounting for 270 more electoral votes pass that bill to instruct the legislature, or whatever, that the electors would be the winner of the national popular vote and not the winners of the popular vote, the winner of the popular vote in the state. So do you like that bill? Do you wish for a constitutional amendment? And most crucially, what I really want to know from you is, do you think, if it should ever happen, that we got states accounting for 270 electoral votes to all pass that act, would the Supreme Court uphold it?
I love the act. I'd be happy to have a constitutional amendment, which I don't see happening, because it just requires too many of the states. I do think the Supreme Court would uphold the law. And the reason for that is that the Constitution is really, really clear that it's up to the states to decide how they're going to choose their electors. Now, just before you feel all happy about that, remember that for that same reason that the Constitution is so clear about that, I think those same justices would certainly uphold it if a state said, we don't care how the people in our state vote. We, the state legislature, are just going to pick the delegates the way they did it at the time of the founding. Because as listeners will know, as viewers will know, at the time of the founding, you didn't have popular vote choosing the electors in the individual states. Usually the state legislature did it. So I think the Supreme Court would uphold that. And because they would uphold that, they would also uphold a decision by the state to allocate electoral votes based on the national majority.
We're just a few minutes from closing, Noah, and I know you're not a professor of, or at least I think you're not, but you're so versatile, you might be a professor of criminal justice, but nevertheless, there are a number of questions coming in that involve that. So let me ask two at once and see how you respond. Sam asks, should the Justice Department and the Democrats be more vigorous in prosecuting the misdeeds of the Trump administration? And Jim asks, basically, should the Justice Department go after Bannon and prosecute him for ignoring the congressional subpoena?
Yeah, I mean, I hold the same chair that Alan Dershowitz used to hold, but unlike him, I'm not a criminal law expert. But since that has never stopped Alan from weighing in on constitutional law issues, I won't let this stop me from talking about these criminal issues, because they're also connected to the structure of the Constitution. My short answer is that there's a reason that the Biden administration and Merrick Garland, who's the Attorney General, who's a person for whom I have tremendous respect, have not been very aggressive in trying to criminally prosecute Trump people. And it's this, Trump tried to break the Department of Justice. And one of the ways he tried to break it was by making it subordinate to the political branch and making it do his bidding and essentially be political hitman. And that was bad. And the only way to restore public trust in the Department of Justice is to convince the public that its agents, both its prosecutors and the FBI agents who are answerable to them, are not prosecuting politically, but are prosecuting based on their independent judgment of the seriousness of crimes. And that requires some bending over backwards to not put the United States in the lock her up mode, to not put us in the mode where each administration comes in and prosecutes those who came before. Now, there are going to be listeners saying, but what are you talking about? The Trump people committed crimes. I hear you and I believe you. But if the Democrats do that now, it removes any impediment from the Department of Justice of Republicans coming in, let's say a new Trump administration, and turning around and prosecuting Democrats. And the resistance to that within the Department of Justice, which Donald Trump called the deep state, was in fact the good resistance that comes from an institution that self-perceives as in important ways independent. So this is a sacrifice that Merrick Garland and the Department of Justice are making, and in my view, it's the right sacrifice. And with respect to Steve Bannon, I think I would say the same thing. He's in contempt of Congress, and in principle, it would be within the power of the Department of Justice to bring a charge. But Steve Bannon was a senior advisor to the President of the United States and a central strategist. And in the past, the DOJ has not typically prosecuted people who are in contempt of Congress. And so to do so here would have the perception, would create the perception that the Democrats were out to get Steve Bannon because of his politics. And the cost is not, the game is not worth the candle. The cost would not be worth the benefits, in my view.
So we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask you 2 more questions. I'm going to ask them in succession and let you answer them in sequence or together, because it's possible that the 2 will merge into one. Jerry asks, what does the future of Trump and Trumpism, and therefore I will add the future of the increasingly maniacal hold that Trump seems to have on a lot of Republicans who in their private beliefs have to know better. What does it hold if he's convicted in one of the other cases that's not a federal case being prosecuted by Merrick Garland? And by the way, thank you for what is by far the most eloquent defense of Garland's posture that I've heard yet. What does it hold if he's convicted in one of those cases? So that's question 1. And question 2, David's favorite question, what gives you hope about the future? So why don't you close with those 2 questions?
I wish I could say that, oh, my hope is that Donald Trump will be convicted in state court, and then that will lead the Republican Party to wake up and have a return of consciousness. But I don't think that's very realistic on either front. Look, I don't think Trump is likely to be convicted of a crime himself. The Trump organization is a different matter. It might be convicted of crimes. Even if Trump were convicted of a crime, I don't think that most of his base of supporters would walk away from him at that point. I think their commitment is connected to a cultural message that they believe that Donald Trump stands up to liberal elites and supports the beliefs that they hold, even if they don't particularly think that Donald Trump is doing much to help them. You know, the coal miners of West Virginia did not get coal mining back, but it didn't make them not like Donald Trump, despite the fact that he promised it to them, because they knew he wasn't telling the truth in the first place. They were responding to the moral message that he was sending them. So I don't think that solves the problem for us. I think that Trump will continue to exercise this influence unless and until the Republican Party finds itself broadly repudiated as a consequence. That could happen in the midterms, though the numbers aren't supporting it at the moment, but it could happen in the midterms. It could happen in the next presidential election, and then we would get some clarity from it. The optimistic part of it that I will say, and the thing that does give me hope, is that despite the fact that so many Republicans are open to Trump, I think some people within the Democratic Party and some people in the Republican Party are gradually starting to realize that there are real concerns that lower middle class and poor white Americans have about how the country has evolved that are not all driven by racism or resentment. Some are, to be sure, but that some are driven by a sense that the middle class has not been able to gain from the tremendous gains that upper middle class people and the very rich have made in the past 25 years in our country. That recognition is the beginning of hope, because that recognition means that the Democratic Party can organize itself, and is beginning to do so, to take seriously the interests of that group of people. And over time, and it will take time, but over time, that kind of responsiveness and a change in the message of the Democratic Party. So it's no longer telling poor white folks, you know, this is your fault, and, you know, it's your own problem and you have privilege. But rather, we understand the pressures that you're under, and the privileges of whiteness are really privileges primarily for the well-off, not really privileges for poor white folks. I think those messages are beginning to be heard, and those are the beginning of the way out of this polarization. I think our polarization is ultimately driven by a genuine feeling by a lot of lower middle class white people that they have been excluded, and they have. And recognizing that will lead us to adopt different policies that will be more inclusive, and that over time have the capacity to bring us back from this brink and to weaken the hold that Trumpism has, so that we will not have Trumpism after Trump. And that's my genuine hope. Not that no one could emerge to offer that, but that the Democrats will be smart enough, as they increasingly are, and as Joe Biden is in a lot of ways, to realize that there's a real constituency with genuine concerns, and that addressing those concerns is the way over time to repairing the polarization and the breach that we currently have in our politics, so that we won't have to break the Constitution. And that's my real optimism. This is bad, but I can tell you, having just written a book about Abraham Lincoln, it's not as bad as it was in the run-up to the Civil War. We are not going to break apart as a country. We are not going to have a civil war. We're going to crawl back from the brink this time too. And I'm willing to bet what I have as a matter of political future, not as a politician, but as a participant and as a citizen, on that eventuality.
Well, I'm willing to bet, thank you so much for that, Noah. I'm willing to bet that the more than 2,000 people on this town hall meeting today will benefit enormously and be intellectually stimulated, as we have been in this hour, and uplifted and deeply educated by your new book that will be coming out on November 2nd. The Broken Constitution, Lincoln's Slavery and the Refounding of America. And I want to say another author of a recently released book, George will be returning next week to talk about that book, American Happiness and Discontents, with one of our most popular hosts, KCRW's Madeline Brand. I want to thank Noah again for his eloquence. We're all lucky to be your students today, Noah. I want to thank Janice and David and Mel and Zev And all of you, we wish you a healthy and safe week until we reconvene. Thank you all.
Thank you, Larry. And thanks, everybody.